Hello, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Very happy to welcome you to this second lecture in the series of celebration of 50th anniversary of John Rawls' A Theory of Justice. Today, in the second session, we have Professor Rajesh Sampath to take us through the question of challenge of democracy from the light of theory of justice of Rawls. Quickly, many of you know Professor Rajesh, but quickly to introduce Professor Rajesh, he is at the University of Brandeis with the Heller School of Social Policy and Social Management. And his interest is in the area of philosophy of justice. And he is the lead investigator for the research on social exclusion. Particularly, he is interested in the questions of caste and intersectionalities on social identities. Rajesh is a well-established researcher in the field of philosophy and has several publications and awards to his credit. And I'm very glad that Rajesh has accepted our invitation to speak to us on this question, which is close to his heart, which he may be teaching regularly for his undergraduate and postgraduate students. And therefore, we have a great resource person for today. The format for today is Rajesh will take us through the conceptual aspects of Rawls in the first half of the lecture today. And then Rajesh has agreed to take few questions and engage in a discussion at that stage. And then he will move to the question of the challenges of democracy. And then again, we will take few more questions at that stage. We request all of you to type in the questions on the chat box at any point. It could be a question, it could be a reflection, and that will be very helpful to engage in this conversation. Professor Rajesh has agreed to look at the chat box from time to time. I will also be looking at and summarizing some of these questions for him. So that's the format for today. So without any delay, we begin, and over to Professor Rajesh.
Thank you so much, Sony. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning, my time, evening, your time. I'm very humbled by this invitation, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for Dr. Sony Palseri and his team at the National Law University in India. By way of my background, my parents are from Tamil Nadu. I was born in Chennai, but I came to the US when I was 3 months old. And so I grew up here in the United States, but my family they're Tamilians from Tamil Nadu. And my dad actually grew up in Bangalore. So Bangalore is a very special place for all of us in my family. So thank you once again for inviting me this morning. In light of the format that Sony had mentioned, what I can do is maybe go for 20 minutes initially, Sony, and see how far we get through the slides. Pause, take some questions, and then we'll move towards what I think is interesting for all of us, is not just Rawls's theories, but how does it apply to our political and social historical present? How does it apply to the issues that are burning in all of us now? You're all studying your master's degrees and law degrees, perhaps PhDs for research. You know, a lot of us are very interested in the status of democracy in India, the United States. You've been watching what's happening here in many parts of the world. So that really, for me, is the crux of today's discussion. Okay, so the first slide will just begin with an introduction to Rawls. If we can go to the next slide. And I want to make sure that's clear on the screen, at least the first line, a summary of a theory of justice. If it's difficult to read the bullet points, don't worry about that right now. I'll be speaking about those. And please tell me if this is too fast or if it's too slow. I'm going to try to do a lot of summarizing in a short amount of time for a book that's over 600 pages long. So we all may have some familiarity with this figure. He may seem like an obscure American philosopher from the 1970s, But in the Western political philosophical tradition, if you go back to the original ideas of the 1600s, from Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, through the French Enlightenment, the revolutionary thinkers that founded the American Constitution, breaking from the British Empire, as India eventually did. And then we'll speak about the Indian Constitution drawing from both the British, American, and French. We have there's this long tradition in terms of the political philosophy that made democracy possible in the modern Western world. So it's very difficult to, when we think of the major thinkers of the last 400 or 500 years, can there be someone in the 1970s from the American philosophical field to emerge in that long tradition? And that's who John Rawls is. He comes from what's called the social contract tradition, and he is arguably the most influential thinker of the second half of the 20th century. And in terms of his practical impact, he's influenced 5 presidential administrations dating back to 1971 to the time of his death, 2002. So enormously influential person beyond the academic fields. So the theory of justice was really an attempt, and there was no other attempt until his, given the dominance of utilitarianism. I don't want to simplify that notion, but if you think of the greatest goods for the greatest number of people. So people consume things, they have mental desires that will trigger their happiness. If they consume a commodity or a resource, if they make money or income, they feel happy. The more people we have doing that, the greater the whole society is doing. Okay, well, that's the dominant foundation for classical economics, and quite frankly, those that justify capitalist economies. I'm going to move to the very end of my presentation on a return to Marx, but that's too soon. I don't want to go to Marx and the Marxist critique right now. But for those that want to live within a capitalist system, you would think that the greatest goods consumed by the greatest number of people will lead to an aggregate whole where you can measure the well-being of the entire society. $20 trillion in the US GDP. India now number 3, maybe number 2 in terms of purchase parity power, but in terms of GDP, India, China, US, dominant economic powers today, unlike 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Well, what does that say really about the distribution of benefits and the structure of inequality in a society, both the US society and the Indian? I'll be doing a lot of comparisons between the two countries. Very little. So Rawls comes along and says, you know what, we need to rethink the whole system without turning to Marxism. So he's not turning to a Marxist critique of capitalism. He's just saying, well, okay, within this system, how can we build a better structure that guarantees justice in the society? That's his main goal. And his experiment begins with this notion of the original position. And you might think, what is this strange experiment he has in his mind? He says, imagine we all go into a room. We can't see each other, so we close our eyes. And you can't hear your voice, a man's voice, a woman's voice, different people from different parts of the world, different accents, different languages. You just hear one generic, like a robotic voice, let's say one language. So you can't really know who's in the room. You don't know who's different. And his argument is that if you give that basic state of human beings with some rational capacity to reason what they want in life, what do they have reason to value over the course of a lifetime? They want to plan their lives. They want to achieve something. They want to, reach some quote unquote level of success. Knowing that we're all different and all we have available to us are the basic facts that we learn from science and the social sciences, sociology, anthropology, political science, economics, whatever those fields teach us, all we have are those and this anonymous sort of impartial space. And he goes, over time, he thinks, and he takes a while to argue this, but most people are going to want these 5 primary social goods. What Henry Shue, the philosopher, would call a fundamental basic right, liberty, because that's a principle that's evolved over history. There was no liberty in antiquity, at least at the individual level, to now the democratic priority of having individual liberty, freedom. Mobility, you don't want to be born into a certain class or caste, as we'll talk about, and have no upward mobility, becoming prime minister, becoming president of a corporation, becoming a professor, the head of a media company. You want mobility. You want positions of leadership and responsibility. You want to be represented in the government so you can shape the laws. You don't want one group of people telling the rest of society how to think and feel. So positions of leadership and responsibility, my screen went away. Wealth and property, obviously in capitalist economies, the priority of wealth and property is self-evident. And this is the most elusive one, the basis of self-respect. That's something we can debate with each other. What is the basis of self-respect derived from those other goods? Long story short, the whole theory of justice can come down to two principles that he thinks is going to emerge from this original position, where the veil is there. You can't see the other people. And the two principles are, there has to be a basic set of political and civil rights for everybody in society, not just one group, the most privileged or the most wealthy, or those in government. Every single group, every single individual society should have the same equal access to a basic set of political and civil rights. Okay, principle one. That's a constitutional democracy. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press. You can think about that. We'll compare and contrast each other's constitutions. The second principle, though, is more complex. There should be equal opportunity. Everyone should have an equal opportunity. That means there has to be basic social guarantees like healthcare and education. Give people a foundation when they're born. Health, education. You can't guarantee achievement and outcome. Different people will reach different levels of success. So no guarantee of outcome, but guarantee of opportunity. When you have that in a capitalist property owning democracy, to quote him, unfortunately, as you have in India, as you have in the US, as you have in Europe, as you have, I don't want to speak to Japan, but at least let's just talk about India and the United States. There's extreme social economic inequality. Okay, so how do we justify the fact that we can't leave this capitalist system and therefore there'll be social and economic inequality, but we want to achieve justice? That's the question. Utilitarianism, look at the GDP, don't look at the inequality or the distribution. Say if a society is very rich, like the United States, it must be doing really well. Well, look at the news. You know that our society has a lot of structural issues, and our democracy for some is under threat, and the inequality is beyond belief. It's never been as bad maybe today as it has been in the last 50 years. So to guard against that extreme type of inequality and potential chaos, Rawls tries to come up with a scheme in which you have to see yourself from the perspective of the least advantaged, the lowest classes with the least expectations. So you can say the lowest socioeconomic classes, and because of historical intergenerational disprivilege, they have the least expectations that the society is going to change. If you start from their perspective, then you can move towards a different system. This is his ideal view. I don't want to get into the details now because I know we have to move to the next slide. You want to think about before we do that, the last bullet. I'll finish the theory of justice, then I'll move to that. And I'm seeing the questions coming in. We'll see that. If we can go to the previous slide. Okay. And there is a blockage here on the right. There's a square. I don't know if people can see that. Is there a way to remove this gray square? It's blocking the right corner. There we go. Great. Okay. So we have to think of a distribution of duties and obligations, mechanisms for savings, ways to structure a scheme so that the least advantaged are the ones that benefit the most, even though there's going to be this differential in outcome and therefore differences in social and economic wealth and privilege. Okay, next slide. So having laid out the structure of the philosophy of justice and what he means a constitutional, secular, legal, perhaps diverse, pluralistic democracy, two of the most diverse and complex for different historical reasons societies in the world, as I mentioned before, the US and India. India in the post-colonial period or since independence. Maybe Brazil, we can think about them. But let's just focus on these constitutional, secular, legally structured democracies. Now Rawls moves us in this work of 1992, political liberalism. he's going to ask even more philosophical questions, maybe not so much about justice, but he wants to get to this raw fact. You think about all the complexities in Indian society between the states, the national government, the current party, ruling party, BJP. You think about the local level of governance. You think about I've been to India twice in my life, and I tell people I've been to other parts of the world. I don't say this because I'm an Indian, of Indian ancestry, but literally India has to be the most mysterious, complex, complicated social structure and culture I've ever seen anywhere. And that's a very bold statement. I don't say that out of pride being an Indian, but it just seems to me that's my observation. So you think of your complexity. Well, in that complexity, there are going to be different religions. We're going to get into the caste system momentarily with different religions. There could be different worldviews and ideologies. Maybe there's a Marxist view, or maybe there's another type of system of thinking. But in any diverse and pluralistic society, you're going to have different religious, what he calls metaphysical, religious, moral, comprehensive doctrines. These are the things that groups or individuals cling to the most when they want to explain their deepest values, what's good, what's bad, what they believe in, their deepest philosophical religious views about the nature of society, individuals, and how to achieve happiness. But if there are different doctrines in the same society, but only one legal constitutional structure, then how do they coexist? I'm going to use the US here, but we now have a 6-3 majority of what are called conservative justices appointed by Republican presidents against the 3 remaining liberal Democrat appointed by Democratic presidents, justices. Given this split, and it's this body, the Supreme Court, just like your Supreme Court, that can decide the constitutionality of what different states are doing. California, Texas, New York, they make their own laws. It's the Supreme Court that judges which state is being constitutionally sound. The problem is, because of the diversity, we don't have one group of people, one society, one state. Different groups have completely different views on everything. Gun ownership, you don't have that. That's the Second Amendment. Abortion, LGBTQ rights, which I want to talk about eventually. Totally different views. The death penalty. You have it, and the United States has it. So different views about these things. Immigration, you can go on and on. Voting rights, housing, et cetera, et cetera. Universal education, canceling debt, student debt, loans. So different groups have totally different views. How does the system survive? Well, if you looked at our last election and you looked at January 6th, some people will say, is it going to survive? We've never seen such a crisis and chaos like this in many, many years. If you've heard of the Black Lives Matter, the rights of peoples who are being oppressed by the state in terms of policing, the disproportionate level of violence that non-white peoples, black and brown peoples face with regard to police compared to white people. Okay, so we have these differences and distinctions. How do we, how does the system maintain itself? How does it get passed on peacefully? These are the questions. His conclusion here is that he thinks there are some mechanisms, you want to go there, some mechanisms in public reason, meaning we have to produce institutions that are not only guaranteeing justice based on those principles that I mentioned, the difference principle, equal opportunity, but there's going to be economic inequality, those principles. But beyond that, the public has to be able to hold those institutions accountable so you can measure some progress in the society. If you don't have that, then what's the point of having your legal, secular, constitutional democracy? You also need to produce the institutions that's going to guarantee the justice. Next slide. You missed one? Yep, there we go. So this work from 1999, for the most part, people think Rawls spent his time thinking about a single society, maybe the one he's most familiar with, the American society, or broadly speaking, Western, either presidential or republic-based democracies like the US, or parliamentary systems. You're familiar with the parliamentary system. But you think he's focusing on one society or one democracy. His last work, major work, original work, is 1999, 3 years before he died. And it's called The Law of Peoples. And there we go. Yeah. So if we can see that. And here I want to be quick. I see it's 7:52. I know we want to pause and take questions before we move to the second half. But just this will be the last piece I summarize before I go to the next phase. When he's thinking about not domestic justice or a single society, but international justice, creatively, he tries to come up with a framework where, of course, he looks at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, he looks at international treaties and covenants, he looks at the moral consensus and norms about war and just war and principles about warfare. You know, the standard issues, international relations, how do nation states compete with each other? How do they form trade relations? So of course, everybody knows that, and you all can read global political economists who study these issues. He comes up with a hypothetical notion of saying, no, I want to talk about an international society. You're thinking, is he talking about the United Nations? Is he talking about the World Bank or the IMF or the World Trade Organization or the the UN Security Council? India is part of that. He's not talking about the actual structures. He's trying to imagine something new. In an international society of peoples, as opposed to an international relations of nation states, he thinks this is the same set of differences that are going to exist across societies. Some societies he calls advanced, developed, liberal, democratic, quote unquote, decent. We may want to deconstruct his terminology here. Maybe he's being Eurocentric, or maybe he's being, although he wants this system of justice, maybe he thinks the Western concepts are superior. We can question that. Then he calls other societies burdened. They want to develop, but they still don't have the political and civil institutions in their society so that everybody in the society is free and is achieving a certain amount of justice that they're demanding. Rogue nations or outlaw are those that he says don't have democracies, maybe are very totalitarian or dictatorial. Some people may think of North Korea as an example. He doesn't deal with that. He's trying to deal with quote unquote developing countries. And the argument is very simple here. And people questioned that, even your previous keynote, Thomas Pogge and others, after this was written, many debates about this. But if you were to summarize the whole problem of the ethics of development into one statement, what Rawls says is that he's going to err on the side of not having limitless economic aid flowing from rich countries to quote unquote poorer countries. Because some societies may not want to continue to develop their wealth because their values are not based strictly on wealth, acquiring wealth for the sake of wealth. Some countries do. They rapidly want to become rich. Maybe they're resource rich like Saudi Arabia, or they developed an industrialized, developed economy after a major war like Japan. They want wealth for the sake of wealth. That doesn't guarantee equality, of course. But he goes, there are going to be other societies who may not have those same desires, may continue to grow their populations, may not align their savings and reinvestments in a way that as the whole population grows by numbers, meaning the society is growing, that doesn't mean the wealth is growing proportionately. It's not being distributed in a fair way. So similarly, he says there's very limited things we can do in those situations. If we can build political and civil institutions so people can exercise their rights, that's one thing. Achieving a pure and fair and equal distribution of all wealth and assets in a capitalist system is impossible. So those are the three major works. And before we transition to his final statement and then apply that to the case of democracy in India, Sony, should we pause here?
Yeah, we have quite a lot of interesting questions. Maybe if you could take a look at the chat.
I'm going to take a look at them real quick. Yep. Big question there. Yeah, excellent questions. Wow. Well, I would like to hear from the audience when we talk about Gandhi's view of the talisman. If yes, here's north-south divide as such. Exactly. Let's critique the north-south distinction. And what kind of compromise Rawls might have thought about. Yep, getting into the balance of the two wrongs make a right, veil of ignorance and decision rule. It makes sense for risk-averse individuals. Yeah, good point. I'll address that as well. Does his original position make sense? These are the people that are the most concerned. What about those that do take risks? Different concept, Adam Smith, Hayek. Sattler, please, which chapter? Black Lives Matter has generated its own very powerful discourse changes. How can we interpret this as important intervention? Yep, we will talk about that in comparison to the anti-caste movements, both in India and the diaspora. Ban background institutions, distribute justice. Okay, so the moral basis of these political and civil institutions. Great. So we have a lot of questions here, and I can't purport to have all the answers. And I wish if I was with you and we were in a group together in a room, I can hear from you and you can elaborate a bit. I can tell you that the reception of Rawls, if you look at across all these excellent perspectives, the utilitarian school that comes back, there are other responses, there are libertarian responses like Robert Nozick, the minimal state is the maximum state, that if you can rationally acquire and purchase through legal and peaceful means and mix your labor with nature to create your own property and commodities and then benefit from the wealth, then the government should be minimal in its attempt to guarantee, these principles of justice that Rawls wants. It's fair. If we all want to pay a cricketer, you watch cricket, I watch basketball, baseball, football. Football is your soccer, so the American football. You want to pay an athlete millions and millions of dollars, but then millions of people are happy to go, spend a few dollars to go see them play. Then that's how the system works, and everything is fine. I mean, there are so many different alternatives to justify the societies we live in. The one that we want to focus on is maybe not that purely libertarian defense of wealth concentration and inequality, the utilitarian model that hopes the whole society grows. I haven't gotten to the Marxist paradigm yet. And then the Rawlsian model, which is, okay, can we strike some kind of balance between this pure system of inequality because of the nature of capitalism? And we don't have a Marxist critique of that yet. But, and on the other hand, utilitarianism, which hopes to guarantee progress for the whole, but has not achieved that to date. So yeah, there are many different schools of thought that argue that Rawls's systems are really, they're too ideal. What is the practical impact of his ideas in an actual society and how it functions? And some may argue that Amartya Sen's work, the Nobel Prize winning economist, you know him, he's very famous for showing that famines are not a product of resources, right? Or even economic organization, but political systems. It's how the British treated the, Bengal, the famine in Bengal, before independence. So he's famous for that, but quite frankly, he's famous for what's called the Human Development and Capabilities approach that's informed the UN Human Development Index, Education, Health, and Income, and the Human Development Reports. It's a broader based concept of well-being. And you want to look at actual capabilities of peoples to see if they can convert them into functions that you can measure empirically. So sorry, Rawls, you can talk about these principles, or other people can talk about welfare and income and resources and commodities like the utilitarians. But quite frankly, we need to really seriously look at what capabilities sets different groups of people have. Education, literacy, mobility, the right to enter the labor market, and can actually be, based on those capabilities, convert them into functions. And the famous example he's given, among many, is that you have two people at the poverty line. One has a disability, let's say kidney issues, and they're on dialysis. And the other one doesn't, but they're exactly at the same level below the poverty line. Well, one can use more of their income to have more freedom than the other. That means you don't have just and equitable policies to compensate for the person who has to spend all their money on their disability, the same amount of money, as opposed to the person who doesn't. So this is the level of the actual determination, which a lot of you are interested in. Is it's not enough to talk about theories of justice or social revolutions. How are we going to measure, measure actual progress in society? Okay, I think there are a lot of the other questions here. We'll keep bringing the questions forward. If I had time, I might go back to Adam Smith and Hayek. Sen actually goes back to Smith. The whole point of political economies and states that form in a division of labor, which is what capitalism guarantees. It divides labor, it specializes it. As Weber says, it's rationally organized. People can contract in it freely, not like slavery. And the whole point is that that's the best way to guarantee as fairly and transparently as possible, because of competition, the true nature of what people want in their consumer societies. And then if the states tax it, you can use that. It's a great way to raise public revenue to then build the institutions that help people. And that really was the moral vision. It's not just a question of laissez-faire. There's a whole complex framework there. And yeah, we can ask Watayek and Nozick, what do we do? Well, the reality is that there are people that take greater risks. And there is this, unbelievable pursuit of wealth by certain tech entrepreneurs. You have examples, but people think of Elon Musk, Tesla, and Jeff Bezos, Amazon, and then Zuckerberg, Facebook. A lot of you maybe use Facebook. So that's the reality. How do we then think about the reality of our situation as opposed to the idea? Okay, so Sony, it's 8 o'clock my time, so it must be 7 p.m. your time.
Yeah, maybe we should move to the second half now.
Move to the second half. Okay, so this is the slide. This is perfect. This is the slide I want to focus on. Justice is fairness. A restatement. Oops, I'm going to go back to the previous slide. There we go. So justice is fairness, a restatement. This was an attempt because he died earlier than expected, and some of his editors and former students came together and tried to reproduce manuscripts of what he was leaving behind. He's trying to rethink his whole life from all of his works, 1971 to 2002. And it's a great work because it summarizes everything that he tried to achieve across all these different works. But if you go to the last chapter, and this is that's the only point I have here, and then we can get into the last slide on the complexity of democracy in India, with some comparisons to the US. Here he lays out 5 different types of societies, and he says that he's going to focus on what he calls the property-owning capitalist democracy. Right now, we'll just say that's India and the US. It's many societies, as you know, but we're going to focus on that. But what about socialist democracies? Well, India can be, at least from the Congress period, claimed to be that. I don't want to diminish the BJP either, but maybe they have a vision of what the socialist structure looks like. You can teach me because you're familiar with the context. But compared to, let's say, property-owning democracy, you can say, like the US, there's the socialist-minded democracies of Scandinavia. Laissez-faire, people think, okay, well, those things exist. Those are really, there's every society in the world has a complex state and regulatory structure and legal system, that, in terms of regulating commerce. So there's no such thing as a purely laissez-faire, free market. What does that mean? Welfare societies, obviously welfare provisions that based on public revenue to help people, as opposed to the market solving all problems. And then in the 20th century, at least, and what remains today, from the communist revolutions to other manifestations, were the purely socialist societies, which would have to be in principle classless, propertyless, and with a central state, typically not a democracy, because of its pluralism. Some people are going to defend wealth versus others, right? But if there's a centralized state, you can try to aspire to this equal state for all, regardless of what we think of the communist revolutions. And Rawls, in a very, towards the end, trying to look at all these different societies, he comes to the conclusion that he thinks his property-owning capitalist democracy is the best, long as you have those principles of justice to make sure the social and economic, the wealth inequality doesn't get so bad that you then destroy that first principle of democracy, political and civil rights. Here in the US, we may talk about oligarchy or plutocracy. And I can get into some of that terminology. A lot of the students in our universities and the Gen Z, the young generation, 18 to 22, millennials, young millennials, many of you, I'm assuming you're graduate students, 22 to 35, 36 years old. Gen X, me, 39 to 53. If you look at these generations compared to the older ones, there's a lot of debate now on all kinds of issues, whether it comes to socialism, climate change, in our case, elimination of guns, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's the last slide. And then if you move, this is my final slide. It's the bullet points are too small. I would say what I want to leave you with, so we can spend more time with the questions if they come in and keep track of them, when I finished presenting Rawls, to be honest, and I really wish I was there, because this way we can have a conversation as opposed to me just talking and responding to questions. Rawls is the last step in, I would say, these Western capitalist, the property-owning capitalist democracies. I don't want to conflate them. You cannot conflate Canada, the UK, France, Germany, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, all very different. On this question of universal healthcare, for example, it took Obama to create it, but now the US Supreme Court, along with the Republican parties, are really trying to destroy this thing. And they've effectively changed some things about it. But it's not this free, unconditional, universal healthcare that you might get in a Canadian society. So Rawls is about as far as I think this Western framework can go, because it truly is still very afraid of Marxism. There's a fear and hysteria built into the American structure, Republican, Democrat. They truly fear Marxism and the Marxist critique of capitalism. That came up in the last election with regard to, oh my gosh, Bernie Sanders and the socialists. Cancel all student debt, raise the minimum wage to a basic living structure, tax the 1%, which owns 40% of the wealth and the assets. What? Redistribute reparations for Black people given to African Americans because of the legacy of slavery. Tax all the carbon emissions, if not eliminate all carbon emissions, and go purely clean energy. Go after the oil and coal companies, foundation of our capitalist, industrialized capitalist economies. Oh my, that's too radical. Okay, let's move to the Indian context. Those are the last 4 or 5 points, and that's where we want to stay for the rest of our discussion. And you may not be able to read it here. So you don't want to go back to Rawls. Utilitarianism, greatest good, income, resource, commodities for the greatest number of people. Okay, well, that's what most people think is the best way to go. I gave a talk on the Indian Constitution based on what I read. I'm by no means an expert. Many of you are. I do know something about the American Constitution, and I know something about the European tradition of political thought, Western European tradition. I mentioned Thomas Hobbes' law all the way up to Rawls. But when I look at the Indian Constitution, what I know and what I've come to understand is that it did draw during independence. Ambedkar chaired the drafting commission, one of India's greatest geniuses. I'll talk about his legacy in a second. But drawing from the best of the British, French, and the American Constitution. But for me, going beyond that, when I read the Indian Constitution, it tries to provide a lot more than these other constitutions do with regard to universal healthcare, education, et cetera. So let's look at the genius of that particular institute. Don't call it a post-colonial or global South or Eastern. Let's just look at this at face value. Look at the potentiality of this ingenious constitution. Not without problems, but I'm going to say superior to those Western precedents. The problem with these Western and Marxist thinkers and the Marxists within the Western traditions is that I'm not sure if they understand the complexity and therefore what would be required in the nature of a social revolution if we were to imagine that today. A lot of folks are focusing on the question of caste, not just the complexity of caste politics, which you can speak in greater detail than I can. But my basic distinction that I can imagine is, okay, if we think about an intergenerational, hereditary, birth-based, cultural, religious, not quite religious, but cultural ethos, the principles, norms, customary norms that determine a society's behavior and stratification. If it's intergenerational, hereditary, birth-based, call that the cultural creation of caste in Indian society. That's not necessarily economic class, and therefore constitutional protections against discrimination in the workplace. To use Ambedkar's great ingenious phrase, the graded inequality, it's not just Smith's division of labor, it's the division of laborers, castes, within a single class or division. Legacy of Ambedkar, yes, ban untouchability, quote unquote untouchability in the Constitution. Ban caste discrimination. There should be no discrimination on the basis of caste. But, oops, the gray screen came back. In a constitutional sense, there should be no caste discrimination when it comes to the Constitution. But that doesn't abandon the caste system itself. My analogy is that abandoning racial discrimination through the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s. The legal structure in the US was segregation, separation in public space, different schools, different neighborhoods, different everything. Blacks go here, whites go here, no mixing after slavery. Certainly no marriage between the two. Think about inter-caste marriage issues in India. So it took desegregation, 1954, Brown v. Board, desegregating the schools that led to the civil rights movements, Martin Luther King and others. And you have this body of civil rights acts, which we should look at. Okay, well, that was the 1960s. What's happened since? 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s are over, now we're in the 2020s. And what I say here, if you look at a lot of the student movements, look at the Black Lives Matter movements, you look at a whole confluence of forces, maybe we can say here, in the US, abandoning racial discrimination, no employment discrimination on the basis of race, white, non-white. Okay, so constitutionally we have protections. That's not getting rid of racism itself as a system. It's what the critical race theorists, the African-American Black legal scholars here, started in the 80s and the 90s. The whole system is based on white supremacy, not just slavery and segregation. We're talking right now. Well, what is that? System of white supremacy and racism against that. Most notably Black people, Latinx, Native American. That's one paradigm people try to talk about. Many people dispute its validity. But when you look at certain groups, and if you look at Black people, 14%, Latinx, 20%, Native Americans, the genocide when the colonies formed, when the British colonies were made, there's so many disparities. COVID has shown that with healthcare, educational outcomes, voting rights when states change their rules, housing access, and certainly wealth and distribution, the question of reparations. Some have argued that if you provided reparations for many African Americans, they wouldn't have died in greater numbers during the COVID than everybody else. So in other words, racial discrimination as an individual act versus systemic racism, two different things. So I guess at 8:14 now, my conclusion, and we can go back to some of the questions I ask here. All right, there's Rawls and there's, one more point here, yep. My question at the end there is, can a truly diverse pluralistic society really achieve this egalitarian justice, egalitarianism, a true distribution of all the principles of justice so everybody benefits, and be the property owning capitalist democracy, and be societies that are complex, diverse, and stratified? This country divides things by race. Indian society still has, as you know, the caste system. How can you maintain all of these in one society and guarantee the justice? It's a very difficult question to answer in this day and age. All of us, younger generations, my generation, we wonder if things can continue as is, or if there has to be a radical transformation of the whole structure. The Ambedkarite me, learning about him, I didn't really know, because I learned, growing up, you learn about Gandhi. Annihilation of Caste, 1936. At least in his case, he made his decision. And I'm not saying you should make that decision, but in the Annihilation of Caste says, okay, well, Hinduism and the caste system, okay, to take out the caste system from Hinduism, well, perhaps you need to reform the basic structures, philosophical, metaphysical, comprehensive doctrines, as Rawls might say. But if you look at his last works, these are the unpublished manuscripts in the collected works, which I'm looking at now, I'm writing about them. One of the last works was on Buddha and the Karl Marx, Buddha and the Dhamma. We know he made his mass conversion to Buddhism. He prioritized Buddhism. I'm not suggesting that or recommending that. I'm just trying to understand, what does he see in either the Buddhist system, drawing maybe from the precedent of Ashoka, but also rethinking Marx in his own way. And both have different things to offer for him to achieve this reform. Not reform, but quite frankly, revolution. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I apologize if it was a lot of information. I usually spend 3 to 4 hours in my graduate seminars with PhD and master's students to try to get through all these issues in a semester, 14, 15 weeks. So to do that in 1 hour is not easy. I see questions. Yes.
Thank you, Rajesh. I think there is, again, set of questions. I think maybe if you could look at the chat box,
Sure.
Especially the question on the relevance of Rawls for today, especially when there is a march of capitalism across the world, and uh, capital moving across borders. What is the
Yeah,
relevance of Rawls? I think that may be an overarching question. And there are some questions on American politics and how a young generations connect in particular way. So maybe you could begin with that. Maybe more questions will roll in soon.
great. Okay, I'll just take a quick look too as well. Let's start with utilitarianism, post-colonial perspective. Yep, moral sense, stronger, not just student debt, also climate change, racial inequalities, healthcare inequalities, whole host of other issues. Post-truth world, interesting, where one's pre-existing convictions about justice are reinforced by social and traditional media sources. Manufacturing consent, yeah, think about that. Free press, you have to dispute what the dominant narrative is. Because Sanders focuses on student debt, have a student debt loan they're ready to pay. Yeah, they're straddled. Millennials, 22 to 38, can't even purchase homes because of the student debt and the changes in the market. So Sanders, okay, so yeah, let's just think about that. It'd be interesting to see how the census is formed in the Indian context, but in the United States, every 10 years they change their census. And they do that by racial category and they do that by age, generation. So I think I've been told India with the youth bulge, this might have been 10 years ago, so it changes, but almost 50% of society is under the age of 30 or 25. Is that right? Very young society. That wouldn't be the case here. But needless to say, you map out the generational differences in your vast, complex, obviously large country. But here we talk about generation alpha, 0 to 7. Those are the very new people that are coming. 7 to 22, generation Z, Zeta, Z. Millennials, 23 to 38. Gen X, 38 to 53. There's 53 to 70. The baby boomers after World War II, 75 to 90. And the disappearing one, as they age. For the World War II generation, they're so old now that they're fading away. But you have all these other generations that coexist. Okay, so the values are totally different. The salience of Rawls today, I think if he were alive, he might say, not only because of what some people think is a political, social, economic crisis, there's a concentration of wealth in terms that are unbelievable. US on record, this doesn't include a black market or black money, or let's say Putin's wealth in Russia. But let's say the US has the most billionaires still. And it does, like 1,500. And then China, because of its reforms over the last 30 years. And then it was Russia, because after the Cold War, Putin's control with his oligarchy of the gas and natural gas industry. I mean, that could be one of the richest group of people, and him specifically, than any of these other billionaires, Bill Gates and all this stuff. But then India now is number 3. So maybe we talk about 100 individuals, or from the British Empire, the state-owned enterprises like Tata. You would know more about the history. But 100 individuals out of 1.3 billion people with a 2 trillion GDP. We can do the gross national income per capita. This is not, we want to talk about inequality and concentration of wealth. Regardless of the political debates about what is the best way to guarantee growth for the whole, utilitarianism, or how do you distribute the wealth? How do you tax? So just leaving this, let's just look at the raw numbers. Okay, the US, China, India. The inequality is so extreme is one thing, because there's a commitment to capitalism. There aren't any Marxist revolutions right now. China, it may have been founded on that, but it's a state-commanded, very aggressive global capitalist system. Hence all this new wealth since their reforms, excuse me. So, how can you have that much wealth concentration and also claim to have a just society? As the predecessor speaker, the great Thomas Pogge, who you heard from, who's had so much influence in these debates for decades and is so concerned, as you know, about the Indian context. Take the concept of extreme poverty. Extreme poverty, as he says, something that leads to an avoidable, foreseeable early death. If you had some basic level of subsistence in your society based on the healthcare and the education and the advancement of the medicine, et cetera, people should live to a certain length of life. There are obviously drug habits and alcohol and smoking. People incur diseases, et cetera. There are environmental issues, but not everybody, of course, will live to the same. But how come some people are dying sooner in certain societies than when they don't have to? And it's due to this extreme poverty. And yet the UN and others do not have still a right to development, a basic right to be free from extreme poverty to avoid early death. His argument is that from the 1970s to now, the detachment of gold from money was a big step. But if you look at the number of people that have died from that, that is more than all the deaths of all the wars across the world, 2 big world wars in the 20th century. So that's point one. More people died from that. Then he has this nice gradation. He doesn't look at the 1%. He looks at the 0.5% of the society, the rich ones, US. You can look at India too. 1%, 0.5%. And then he sees how their wealth has increased dramatically over the last 50 years. And then how much there's the 1 to 15%, top 15%, owning 85% of the society. But then there's 75% of the society. And then, the diminishment of what's occurring here. You have to focus on electricity and utilities, and sanitation, and public infrastructure, and figure out water issues. There's so much going on in India right now, not just from Modi's election in 2014. So to think about this extreme inequality and think about how impoverished larger bases of the population have become, for me, that invites a view, whether we want to reckon that or not. It's very difficult for me to talk about these things, quite frankly, in the American context, because if you bring up Marx and Marxism, which the younger generations, I love talking to them about it. They get excited because they can go into Capital, 1867, all 1,000 pages, and you read every line in it. And it's regardless whether you want to become a Marxist or a communist, just read the text and try to see what his analysis of the nature of capitalism is. Because if it's something inherent in the nature of capitalism, then we do have to dream of something new if you want to solve the climate change, global sustainability, and not have the bases of the population so impoverished that they can't continue to live. Becoming rich is one thing, surviving is another thing, but not having enough and therefore you're not able to live. I mean, if that's not a violation of a basic human right, then the right to life, not just liberty and property, but the right to life. Once that goes, what do we have as a humanity? We have nothing. So I would like to think about the possibility of a 21st century, what I call a 3.0 Marx. 1.0 is the Marx from the 1800s. He wrote, he thought, didn't live to see major revolutions, joined and formed socialist movements. Lenin, 1917, is the 20th century. Mao, 1949, Castro, the communist revolutions. Okay, that's the 20th century. I'm more interested in the 21st century. And I wonder, because Marx is not enough either. He himself is narrow in his European, first of all, he lives in the 1800s. He has that narrow European frame. He doesn't understand the complexities of other societies. And unfortunately, we would say it now from our perspective, would say as post-colonial critics call his views racist, because he talked about the Oriental modes of production, referring specifically to India, as did other European thinkers, because of what they call the quote unquote vegetative state of an eternal system of stratification, caste. So the modes of production, slavery, master-slave antiquity, serf, trapped in the land, trapped in a caste, born into a caste, have to stay in that particular function, can't leave the land, a sovereign or a king protects and defends, and there's a stratified system that doesn't change, Middle Ages, serfry, capitalist, worker, formerly free, contracted labor, and the capitalist property owner. 3 systems for modes of production, changing over time. And for him, a place like India, in his writings would have said, okay, it's because of this caste system, as Ambedkar tried to diagnose. The shift from a capitalist mode of production to a socialist one will be hard to attain. That was his view. So then let's fast forward to the 20th century. Let's think about the legacy of Ambedkar. What will it take if this is the goal? And I'm not saying that's your goal. Maybe it's my goal to dream of, like he did, the possibility of the total elimination of caste, the propagation of the 3 principles, liberty, equality, fraternity, cooperation. That's Rawlsian in many respects. Although Rawls comes much later than Becker. He's drawing from John Dewey, earlier figure. But the ability, reciprocity, the ability to share, to cooperate, to disprivilege, and maybe resource others or distribute in a different way. The fraternal cohesion, the endosmosis, that naturally we can only grow together collectively, not just as individuals. But then you want the individual liberty and the equal protection of all individual groups in a diverse society. How do you have all three? And what's the best form of government to guarantee that? You would think it's a democracy, but maybe you have to debate that. I can speak from the US perspective, but I think a lot of people, they've lost the trust. What the heck is this democracy in this two-party system and a Supreme Court with the conservative justices that can overturn more liberal states on issues that matter the most to people right now? For us, it's going to be abortion, young generation of people. Legalization of gay marriage, that doesn't exist yet in India. There's legalization of third gender. There's decriminalization, but positive rights, legal right to marry, with all the benefits that come from that. What if that's taken away? Freedom from employment discrimination for LGBTQ peoples, commerce discrimination. So there's so many different, so many different issues that we're facing now, where one has to ask if a constitutional democracy and a political system of democracy, the Republican version of the parliamentary system, which you're familiar with, is that enough to guarantee these principles of justice? I think we're living at a threshold where the answer has to be, I don't know anymore. I'm saying that as a 50-year-old. I should have more hope. I should be more mature enough to say, no, you need to defend me. I don't know. I listen to the young people and I wonder if there's going to be a groundswell and a radical transformation of the structure maybe in our lifetime. In your lifetime, you're younger, but maybe if I can see it in my lifetime, some radical change must occur. Sony, we're at 8:29.
Yeah, maybe if you have time, there is a question on whether Rawls is useful and helpful to deal with political polarizations. If you have reflections on that, maybe we could take that question before we close.
That gets us to the political liberalism. Some people argue that, yeah, he does have some, maybe those two principles, political and civil rights and equal opportunity for all, but admitting there'll be economic inequality because some people are going to achieve different things based on their labor and what they want to do. But there should be some basic principles on savings and taxation, et cetera. So you take care of the least advantaged. So every generation, that least advantaged group has a right to achieve something. Has an ability to achieve something. That sounds great as a theory. But the reality of our democracies, you look at your Indian democracy, and I have some examples actually from the Indian. I'd love to talk to you about that someday in terms of the legal disputes. It could be affirmative action. We call that, you say reservation, affirmative action. But I'm very interested in the religious pluralism, and as was Rawls. His dissertation was on religion, by the way, as an undergraduate. And that political liberalism, how can you have these different metaphysical, religious, quote unquote, comprehensive moral doctrines? People come from different religious backgrounds. Think of the Islamic group and the principles and values. Think about the Ambedkar as Buddhism. Think about the Hindu majority, Hinduism. Here you can still talk about a Christian majority. Different systems of beliefs that determine what we truly do can decide on in terms of laws and policies. Abortion is a big one. LGBTQ rights. How do these differing comprehensive doctrines find certain principles that can be passed down from one generation to another, so the democratic society says, okay, even though we have totally different views on so many different things, we can at least admit to these certain commitments that we all should make. And he offers, I'm trying to remember one specific case. Oh, well, it's bringing me back to this comparison of the constitutions. Let's think about this. We'll think about your context. We'll think about the US. First Amendment, religious freedom, and it's called a joint. I don't know if you can see this because my screen's frozen. But Sonia, I don't know if you can see me moving, or is it my screen frozen?
I can see you moving, yeah.
Okay, you can see me. Maybe I can't, that's fine. So if you can see this elbow here, government can't be founded in the American Constitution on a single religion called Christianity. Inversely, government can't get in the way of different religious groups expressing their views freely. This can get very complicated because some religious groups can say, like the cake maker in Colorado, I don't want to serve a cake to a marriage for two gay people. I don't believe in this. I own the cake shop. I'm making the cake for the wedding. They can go somewhere else. Well, obviously, in this case, they got this couple who has a legal right to marry couldn't get a cake. What's more important, you know? But that's symbolic in a way. Getting the cake, that's freedom from discrimination in commerce. The competing doctrines in the United States impacts the state law, and look at the disparate impacts on minority groups, right? So that's one example we can think of. You correct me if I'm wrong, but Modi, we heard about this question of citizenship. So if you're Hindu, Buddhist, or Jain of the Hindu family of religions, and you live in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and you want to repatriate back to India, you can do that. But what about Muslims? They weren't included. What about India having the second largest Muslim population? First, second? Second behind Indonesia. Nigeria is coming. Middle Eastern countries are smaller. I talked to Indian Christians, and I tried to understand what the situation is. And then finally, the perennial question caste for the Dalit movements, which I support, I'm an ally with, and I write about, and I try to advance thinking about Ambedkar's philosophy and the critique of caste. Think about Dalit liberation. To suggest, as did Gandhi during his fast in 1932, that hey, if you convert from Hinduism, which is impossible because you're born into it, right? We're all born into these castes. If we come from that system, the only way out is death, as Ambedkar said. But people attempt to convert out of them into Islam or Christianity, or maybe like Ambedkar into Buddhism. It's one thing to say that if you convert out, but you stay within Hinduism, or you go to an Eastern offshoot or derivative, quote unquote, like Buddhism, which Ambedkar argued is not the case because he claims Hinduism stole from the original principles of Buddhism and then made it its own in his work, Counter Revolution, Brahmanism, and Regicide. But if you stay with these Eastern religions, then you get all the benefits of the state, the reservations, et cetera, et cetera. But if you leave it and you go to these, non-Indian, non-Hindu, non-Western, non-Eastern, these Western type, then you won't have the same benefits. That is discriminating on the basis of religious difference. And yet that's exactly what some of us think is happening with regard to this majoritarian, nationalist, ideological sense, the Hindutva. Very complicated questions. Can you achieve an Indian society finally without caste? And believe it or not, in the American society, the Alpha, the Gen Z, and the youngest millennials, the majority is non-white. Think about that paradox. Obama, they say he's the first Black president. He's really the first multiracial. Multiracial people's fastest growing group. 1% of society in 1960, 10%, and rapidly growing. Kamala Harris, you know her, of Indian roots, multiracial. So the majority in our society is going to be non-white, and yet the entire system, according to critical race theorists, is to the benefit of whites. Well, the last time that happened, that's called apartheid in South Africa. And you saw what happened there and what's happening now. So you got to ask the same question in the Indian context. How does the wealth get distributed? How do people have the greatest opportunities? And whether you believe in your heart of hearts that caste has something to do with the impossibility of achieving that just state. You may say, no, I don't think caste is an issue anymore. Okay, let's talk about that. But some of us may say, well, wait a minute, is it really still an issue? And how do we think about it? Too simple. I simplified the issue. You know how much more complex the situation is. Okay, Sony, it's 8:37. I can keep going still. I don't know if there are more questions that are coming in or if there are other things. Sony, would you like to say a few things or?
No, I don't have anything to say. I must just thank you. And this has been very gripping session. Usually we see a huge drop after the presentation, but here we could see people sticking to it, listening to your clarifications and discussions. I'm very thankful to you for having accepted and delivered this lecture. For all the members in the audience, I have just put in the chat box our series. Next week, we have another session comparing Rawls' views and Gandhian views on fairness. We had a question on talisman. Maybe we look at that question more detail in the next session. That is a little early next week, 2:30 Indian time. You will get all the invitation, those who have registered. Thank you again, Rajesh, for accepting this invitation. It was a great lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sony. Thank you, everyone. I wish I can be there with you. And I talked to Sony about this before, but maybe in the future we can get together. I'd love to meet people and talk to them and learn from them, where we can compare Marx, Rawls, and Bedekar, many different figures, Western, Eastern, both traditions. How do we discuss these great thinkers? And then how do we apply them practically to the present situation? So hopefully we can do that in the future.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye. Be safe. Be healthy.